Hello, everyone. It's lovely to be here with you all for the launch of Andrew's Credo. I suppose that if this book is his creed, his confession of belief, then I am here to testify and bear witness, to offer some kind of proof of life, of concept, of the pudding. I first met Andrew Feldmar in the mid-1990s when I was in pieces at my wit's end. My husband Rob and I had come back to Vancouver in 1990 after having spent 3 years in apartheid South Africa, where we kept a safe house for leaders of the underground liberation movement. It was something great to be involved in, but it was dangerous and I was always afraid. In the end, our unit was discovered and Rob and I had to flee the country to avoid arrest, leaving behind comrades who were arrested, knowing what that could mean for them. Arriving in Vancouver was as bizarre as arriving in Johannesburg had been. I remember trying to cross Broadway one afternoon on my way to a job interview. The other side of the road was suddenly incomprehensibly much too far away. The street too wide, too many lanes. I couldn't fathom the traffic lights, the traffic. I couldn't move. I think I managed to ask a fellow pedestrian for their arm. Anyway, I did get across and I got the job. But I was clueless about what was happening to me. Mostly I faked being fine. I couldn't seek help because it was still a time when talking could be dangerous for others. And I didn't think I'd be heard or believed. I didn't want to be drugged or locked up as a crazy person. And from a mental health perspective, my going to South Africa in the first place, I knew was pathological. I eventually confided in a South African activist friend in Vancouver who recommended Marshall Walensky as a therapist. I went to see him, and it was a great relief to talk to someone. I remember after maybe 6 months wondering why it was taking so long to get better. I complained to Marshall that I just want to be normal, and he laughed, saying I was well past normal, which rather pleased me. When he and his wife Patricia went to Ireland on sabbatical, he suggested I contact Andrew Feldmar, so I did. I tested Andrew a lot at first. He said, as he does in Credo, that mental illness was just a bad metaphor for problems in living, that we were all in the same boat figuring things out together. He wasn't going to do anything to me, and I didn't have to please him, all of which was reassuring. And being Hungarian, he wasn't freaked out about my politics or where I'd come from. That we had gone to shelter people from a vicious regime reminded him of the woman who had sheltered and hidden him as a child. From his stories of Hungary and his flight by himself in 1956, I knew that he knew about war and evil and resistance and wasn't afraid to face harsh realities. I started work at Banyan Books around the same time, another piece of luck. Banyan specializes in psychology, spirituality, healing, esoterica, all that was new to me. And I had access to all the books, all the traditions, worldviews, the teachers and healers. The image I have is of someone snatching book after book from this gigantic wall, flipping through one, tossing it over her shoulder, grabbing the next. Very motivated, very messy, the clueless one looking for clues. As my distrust of Andrew diminished, so did my self-control. I was still living a kind of double underground life. 4 days a week, I was a hardworking bookseller. The rest of the time was more or less shaky. If I wasn't in bed, I couldn't stay still, would walk the trails in Stanley Park for hours. I saw Andrew on Wednesdays, my day off. His room was where I could fall apart, and I did. He caught me and held me as I shook and raved. He called it regression, suggesting I was struggling to be born. Andrew regularly traces troubles back to the family, early childhood, the womb, even conception. I am regularly annoyed by that, but sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes I wanted to believe him. I had had a bad time as a teenager and mostly figured it was due to the bad in me. At some point, he rhetorically asked, "What on earth did they do to you?" And I felt some chains I didn't know about start to lift from my chest. Another time, I panicked on the way to a session and barely got myself to his office. Andrew opened the door, saw I couldn't move, gently gathered me up and helped me inside. "Oh," he said, "have you frightened yourself?" I felt a laugh inside, a lift. He smiled. No shame. We carried on. In those days, I always kept him in mind, like he had hold of the end of my kite string. I would copy pages of my journal and leave them at his door, phone his work number just to hear his voice on the recording. When I told him so, he raised an eyebrow and called it a fetish. But if I phoned him in the 10-minute gap between sessions, he would sometimes answer and talk me down from whatever incipient state I was in. When I was lost at sea, he was a lighthouse, not rushing out to rescue me, just a constant beacon holding the space between us. I trusted him not to come after me and also not to desert me. He trusted me to find my bearings. He said I was like a rabbit hiding in the bush, ready to bolt. All he could do was wait quietly for me to decide to come out. His precision showed up my confusion, which was helpful. I learned to learn from him. I also ordered books for him, which I always skim through before delivering. Books by Maurice Blanchot, Edmond Jabez, Jan Petočka, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, Alfonso Lengas, of course, also poetry. They also opened new ways of thinking to me. Then I went to hear Andrew speak on a public health panel at Harbor Center one evening. He mentioned a Lithuanian philosopher who was doing the most interesting work on ethics. Listening, I felt this shock like dry lightning, and the back of my neck was all tingly. Later I asked, who are you talking about? He said, Emmanuel Levinas. First I'd heard. It was such a weird moment, but Levinas would be and still is central for me and my work. Rob and I visited South Africa again in 1995, a year after Mandela's election. We decided to move back, but gave ourselves time to finish our undergraduate degrees in Vancouver. Still chasing my big questions, I took classes in humanities and philosophy. I was drawn to continental thinkers and the ancient Greeks, especially the skeptics. Not knowing suits me very well. I like how Dorothy Allison put it. There are 2 or 3 things I know for sure, but they're not always the same things, and I'm not always so sure. I think my affinities for skepticism and phenomenology may be similar to Andrew's because we both underwent what he calls ruptures in the book, when a previous way of life is no longer tenable and neither are the conventional beliefs that upheld it. It's like a pyramid of tins at a grocery store. Dislodging a few at the top or on the edges is fine, but when the base collapses, it all falls down. Belief itself is put in question, which puts everything in question, including oneself, one's sense of self. Then, if we manage to survive the disaster, how do we go on? The tempting but wrong answer, at least for me, was to try to restore the pyramid and get back to normal. The better answer, because more true and more free, more lively, was to engage with the disaster, however that was possible, learning to stay as best one can, to go all the way down, see what remains, what's real, learning to live again otherwise. This path is not one of techniques or management. It's relational, inside and out, a practice of attention and orientation, following scents and clues, a work of art and of artful dodging, transformation perhaps, metamorphosis. As Leon Redler has said, we have to do it ourselves, but we can't do it alone. We need at least one faithful companion. That's how it works. This is what Andrew's radical to the roots psychotherapy is. And it is the heart of Credo, this book, how he survived, what he has come to believe in and to live by. It is a record of one man's formation over time in community and communion, and it's an open incitement to every reader. Rob and I moved back to South Africa in 1997. I couldn't find work in the book trade, sadly, and ended up doing a master's in philosophy at the University of Stellenbosch. I was finally able to work through Levinas and come to terms with my questions about armed struggle and its justifications. I also heard about philosophical counseling then, which was just getting started in South Africa, another bit of luck. The combination of philosophical and therapeutic practice made obvious immediate sense to me, and I thought that this was something I could do and wanted to. I started my practice in 2002 based on Levinas's view of ethical relational subjectivity and with Andrew as my supervisor. I may be a counseling philosopher rather than a psychotherapist, but I do feel part of the lineage. I tell my people Andrew's stories the way he tells Ronnie stories. But beyond the family resemblance, Andrew is not Lang's replica, nor am I his. In the same way, therapy varies with every session, every person. But replication, genetic or scientific, was never the point. The work here is for each of us to come to our senses, to free ourselves, educate ourselves, become who we are in the company of someone who offers their skillful, careful, and loving attention. And then, maybe, because it seems obvious and necessary and delightful, to figure out how to offer that to others, ourselves, in our own way. That's it. And here I am, happier than I ever expected to be, with good work, good friends, my best beloved, still lucky, still ruptured, still not normal. I know how it is to be a first-person singular, to say, here I am. But that singularity identifies with very little, almost nothing. It is not an undivided self. It is not self-reflexive consciousness in the way Western philosophy would have it. This doesn't make me quake anymore. It makes me curious, makes me think, what is going on here? What could it all mean? I don't know, but I think I'm getting there. Andrew is bemused by much of this, and our 30-year conversation carries on. Neither of us could have predicted or planned this future, but here we are, and I wouldn't be here without him. As Hannah Arendt once said of her teacher, Martin Heidegger, there exists a teacher. One could perhaps learn to think. And where there exists a person, one could perhaps learn to live after all. Thank you. Best of luck. Buy the book.